Well, welcome to Art in Focus. It's 7 o'clock, so I suppose we'll get started. Just like last time, I did have some problems with the live stream to YouTube, but I was able to fix it this time, which makes me feel good because we have somebody joining us for Art in Focus who isn't an employee of South Shore Arts. So I would have been a little bit more embarrassed had it not worked properly. I'm going to keep my introduction relatively short today before we get on with the program. A little bit of first, I want to make sure I thank our sponsor, Community Healthcare System, as well as Joe Rowan, who was a guest this year on Art in Focus, for letting us use some of his original music before each of our virtual events. I want to make sure I touch upon housekeeping. There's two things I generally say as we start these programs. The first being that we live stream these events to YouTube. So I know that some people will be joining us through that platform. We don't monitor the chat on YouTube. We only monitor it in Zoom. So if you are interested in submitting a question or communicating with myself or our presenter tonight, then you'll have to sign off YouTube and hop on over to Zoom, which brings me to my next point, which is that we use both the Q&A as well as the chat feature. So if you have a question, please by all means submit it at any point during the presentation. We may wait till the end to ask the question, but we might just stop in the middle if it seems like it's of the moment, and we'll let Marcia, who's our presenter tonight, answer that question. That's housekeeping. I think the only other announcement that I have is the announcement that I made last time about the IAC's On-Ramp program. That program is a sort of creative, an entrepreneurial accelerator course for artists who are looking to make their practice part or all of their livelihood. And normally that takes place at one location in Indiana, but this year it's taking place in 5 locations and being led by 5 different teams. And one of those teams is in Northwest Indiana. We are collaborating as lead partner with a local artist named Sam Love, as well as the Society of Innovators at Purdue Northwest. Right now on our homepage, South Shore Arts homepage, that is, you can find an interest form. There's a little square that will link you to the interest form. If you're interested or you know anybody who might be interested, please share that. That will allow us, if you complete that form, to make sure you have reminders about deadlines or any workshops we might be doing to help fill out the application for the program. That's up now, but the actual application is live on May 10th. And then the deadline for the application is June 24th. So there's plenty of time. But if you need to know any more information, that's where you go for it. Without further ado, I want to welcome Marcia. Marcia Carson is going to go ahead and turn on her camera and her microphone. Marcia has been a guest at Art in Focus in the past. She's given us some great presentations. I have no doubt that this one will be any less. So Marcia, I'm going to turn it over to you, and you can let me know when you want me to bring up pictures or the slide presentation, and I'm just here to help you.
Okay, so do you have that picture that Summer?
I do. So let me go ahead and grab that. Marcia, you can just say whatever you'd like to say to everybody while I hunt that picture.
Okay. I'm glad to be here, and I have to admit, I am more nervous than I have ever been speaking in front of a group of 150 people. And all I'm talking to is Micah and a screen. But somehow it's very strange. That's just not in my comfort zone. When I agreed to do this, Summer contacted me and sent me this picture that she pulled from my Facebook page and said, could I use this for the advertising? And I thought she was joking. And I said, oh, I know I have better photos. She said, no, I really love it. So I looked at it and went, oh my gosh. So hopefully I look a little better tonight, maybe not. because this was after I had let a plant grow in my garden that I was pretty sure was a native plant I had put there. It had beautiful little white flowers. I loved it. And then in the fall, I leaned over it to pull some weeds, and I came up so covered with burrs. So what I originally loved, I ended up hating. The plant is now gone. Just because it's pretty doesn't mean you should keep it. So if you'd like to go to the first slide now, that would be great. From the first picture, you will realize I do more than just art. I am a master gardener, I am a master naturalist, and I could live outside. I did spend 39 years teaching art in Hammond, including AP art history, and I taught at IUN for 25 years, teaching mostly art history classes. So art history is definitely a love of mine when I'm not out in the garden. When I was preparing this presentation, I actually went to Facebook and polled my former students, friends, and said, okay, I know what I always thought was hard to teach because the kids just didn't get it. They didn't understand it. But are you having any other issues now? So some of the things we'll look at today are images that other art teachers or students said, you know, I still just don't get it. I sure don't love it. So we're not looking that you have to love everything, but I want you to try to understand it. These four images were things that were brought up over and over. Nobody seems to understand Willem de Kooning, Marcel Duchamp, you've got to be kidding. And you just throw a little paint around and you become famous. How did Jackson Pollock do that? And how in the world can people like Robert Rauschenberg, when all he does is paint his canvases white? Sometimes they have a black line on them. So next slide, please. Okay, these are images that probably everyone is very familiar with, you're comfortable with, and we would never question whether they are art. Whether you love them or not, that's really not the important part. It's, do you understand them? Are you comfortable with them? But they might not be your favorites, but you certainly aren't going to hate them. They're within your comfort zone, and that's pretty important when we look at art. If it's out of your comfort zone, you probably certainly don't love it. Good art for a long time had to be something that existed in either myth, history, religion, or reality. Next slide. Thank you. So a little bit of background. This is an image from the Salon de Paris, the official show and the only permitted public art exhibit in France. And it had been held at the Louvre starting in 1725. This image was done in 1785 by Martini, and it is actually an engraving of what the salon looked like in 1785. The salon was critical in artists' lives. If they couldn't get their work into the salon, their futures as artists were questionable. If you got into the salon, you got government and private commission. So artists like we looked at in the slide before didn't follow those rules. They sort of messed up and it was hurting them. I find it interesting when we look at this with our 21st century aesthetic, we go, oh my gosh, look at all those paintings crammed on those walls. This is just not the way you display art. Well, this was 1785 in the context of Europe, of France. This was perfectly acceptable, and this is what was expected. One of the things that I find interesting is context is so important. About 20 years ago, I went to Japan with a group of art teachers, and we attended some gallery shows of artwork. And this is pretty much what they looked like. Things were hung side by side. You could barely find the wall behind them. And it was just a visual overload that did not meet our aesthetic as the art teachers from Indiana, but in Japan, it was perfectly acceptable. And another one was we had an exchange student. My husband and I hosted an exchange student from Thailand. She did her senior year of high school in Indiana, actually in Hammond. And then she went to 4 years of college and got a degree in graphic design from an American university. She went back to Thailand and was supposed to join in her family's print business. They were printers, and she was going to be the designer. One of her assignments was that she dealt with some of the shops, the very prestigious shops, and was supposed to design shopping bags, you know, like where the Kardashians shop, not where I shop. And when she would meet with the clients and have this design for the bags, she said everybody wanted to cram more in. They felt like they weren't getting their money's worth if it was very simple and plain and there was 4 square inches of white. They had to cram something in. That was not that long ago, but it was a different country, a different context, a different aesthetic. I am referring to my notes just to make sure I don't miss anything I think is important. Okay, next slide, please, Micah. This is what the jury expected to see when they were selecting their paintings, their artwork for the Salon of 1785. History, portraits, landscape, genre, and still life. These pieces were accepted because they followed the rules and they were very understandable in that context, at that time, in that place. David's Oath of the Horatii, completed in 1784, was based on a Roman legend, but it presented a historical message. Adelaide Labille-Guiard, self-portrait with 2 pupils, completed in 1785, was a beautiful self-portrait of her and her pupils. I'd be dazzled if she really painted in that outfit, but that's what a self-portrait or a portrait should look like. Now we're going to move forward before we get to the next slide. We're going to move forward and think it's 1863. 2/3 of the paintings that were presented to the jury for the salon were rejected, much to the dismay of obviously the artist, but also a lot of the public. Courbet, Manet, Pissarro could not get into the show. The government, and that specifically was Napoleon III, he created the Salon des Refusés, those that were refused from the salon. It was to satisfy the public, but he also completely expected that the critics would ridicule the entire show, which they did. The critics were brutal, but the exhibit did legitimize the emerging art forms. Next slide. A decade later, now it's 1874, and Claude Monet enters Impression Sunrise into the exhibition of the Impressionists, not the Salon, the exhibition of the Impressionists. The name Impressionist was actually coined from this painting. It was used by the critics to deprecate the artwork because it also did not follow the rules. What were those strange colors? What are those yellows in the water? What are those flat black shapes? What's that brushwork that doesn't define anything? It's unfinished in the eyes of the critics at that time. So at that time, we're looking at, was this really art? How could you love it? Well, after a rough start, Impressionism dominated the art world for over 150 years. Everyone loves Impressionism. You may or may not, but in general, everyone loves Impressionism. And it has inspired many art movements. In 2019, one of Monet's Haystack series, one painting, sold for 110.7 million, setting an auction record. Obviously, the work that was rejected 100 years before is now at the top of the market. Next slide, please. 3 more images, all faces, one with a little more than just the portrait. And do we consider these to be art? Do we love them? Do we not love them? The one by Francisco de Goya, Saturn devouring one of his sons, was done in the early 1800s, well before the Impressionists, but it was accepted. Why was it accepted? It was a Roman myth, originally based on a Greek myth, that Saturn believed one of his sons would overthrow him, just as Saturn had overthrown his father. To prevent this, Saturn ate 6 of his children. You can't overthrow someone if they're not there anymore. But the wife hid the 3rd son on the island of Crete and replaced her son with something else that Saturn ate. But the prophecy did come true. Jupiter, the son that had been hidden in Crete, he did overthrow his father. So it was a myth. It was something that everybody understood. So no matter how gruesome, and I want you to look at that object closely as he is devouring a child, which doesn't look like a child, it looks like a very small adult, but that was acceptable. We will be looking at some rather gruesome and gory things later. So I want you to think about the context. Why is this one okay and others later are not? Vincent van Gogh, we all know, was not accepted in his time. And when we look at this portrait, self-portrait, we see colors. We see unusual colors for a face. We see a lot of brushwork. We see a lot of expressive emotion. We do not see a beautiful self-portrait. Even Rembrandt back in 1630, his self-portrait is very expressive, done with line. I believe this is also an engraving. So we're looking now at expression, but Goya's expression was accepted. Vincent van Gogh's was not. Next slide, please. And then all of a sudden in 1910, Alex Jolensky creates this rather offensive in many people's minds image, right? Why do people have such a difficult time with this image? It really has a lot in common with the images we saw in the past slide. There are some rather aggressive visible brush strokes. The colors are not blended well. There are flat planes of color with black outlines. The body and face are disproportionate. It's definitely expressive. It's not imitational. Therefore, some people find it very difficult to love. But is it really different than looking at the Van Gogh or the Goya? It's about a portrait, and we don't know who this person is, and that's okay. But it's about the inner person, not the exterior. Now, this one became much better accepted in general by the public, but next slide. This one seems to create a lot of issues. How can anyone love this painting or any of his woman series? Like the Jolensky girl with the green face, this painting is based on feeling rather than intellect. It's an art that shows his struggle. It shows his painful, personal expression, and it's very explosive in nature. Thick paint, slashing brush marks, black outlines. It's very large. It's 6 feet tall by 5 feet wide. You can't escape it. If you are in front of it, you are confronted with it. It is in your face. De Kooning's explanation of his work was that he alluded to, in his painting, long-held societal ambivalence between reverence for and fear of the feminine. I immediately thought of my mother, and not that she physically looked anything like this, but there was a reverence for her as the mother, but as a child, there was a little fear there too. What could mom do if we didn't do what we were supposed to do? What would mom do? My brothers and sisters would be the first ones to tell you, we often huddled in a corner and said, what would mom do if we did that? What would happen to us? So I understand that fear of a woman, yet complete reverence and complete love of women. So how do you feel about this one? Do you revere her? Do you fear her? What makes us think about revering her? Is it her very solid stance? She is sort of looking towards you, not at you, but towards you. So we can't really communicate with her. We are in the background looking at her. And Micah, do feel free to ask any questions if anybody happens to have any, or anyone wants to make a comment.
So far, nobody has, but I guess that's a good reminder that everybody should feel as if they can enter any questions into the Q&A.
Questions or comments. If they have anything to say, I'm certainly willing to listen. Okay, the next slide is also a very difficult one for many people. Francis Bacon, Figure with Meat, 1954. This happens to be at the Art Institute in Chicago, and we can't help but look at this and go, what was that artist thinking? We have this man who looks somewhat royal, maybe. It almost appears that he's sitting in some kind of a throne, but it isn't really a throne. It's meat carcasses. What in the world is this about? Well, this also goes back to number one, our comfort level. We tend to just turn away from it. We don't really want to look at it. And the context in which it's done. And many times that's the context of the particular artist. It's not necessarily across the world, across the country. It's the particular artist and the time frame in which that artist is living. In this case, Bacon grew up in Ireland and was very familiar of the brutalities of war. He considered himself a painter of brutal fact. He was not interested in glamorizing anything. It's all about the brutality of life. He did it in 1954 in the post-war spirit. It's unsettling, yet it's very powerful. He's questioning the value of human life, general despair, frustration, anger that he felt about society. Now I'd like to go to the next slide and see where he got ideas. Diego Velázquez painted the portrait of Pope Innocent X in 1650. And Rembrandt painted many a side of beef throughout his life. So what Bacon has done is taken two different images and consolidated this. And what we see is very similar to a pope sitting in a throne, royalty sitting on the throne, but the clothing is simplified, and that throne has become these two slabs of meat, which to him showed the viewer his views about post-war and how things were not what they should be. You never knew what was there. He also was contemplating the power of the Pope, of religion, of what was going on in the world. When I look at this, I see the Pope, because of the lines behind the meat, almost appear to put him in a glass box. I sense some kind of a cry or some kind of sound emanating from his mouth, but yet I hear nothing. And then to be surrounded with this decaying meat, it definitely is rather nightmarish in its form. And that's exactly what Bacon was trying to do, was create this nightmarish idea of what society was at the time. So it's all about context. On a lighter note, next slide. Nobody's going to argue whether they love these. Nobody hates them anyway. We're looking in the middle is an African American face jug. On the right is a Greek amphora. On the left is a Mesoamerican stirrup pot. On the lower left, we have two contemporary ceramic pieces. And on the right, we have some ceramic bowls that are mass produced. They're lovely. Nobody's going to hate them. All ceramic vessels. Now, let's go to the next slide. This is also a ceramic vessel. It's made of clay. Do you love it? Most people either hate it or don't understand it until they're educated a little more about it. It was mass produced, as was the Greek amphora and the bowls that we saw on the last slide. So I'd like you to think about context. The urinal was invented in 1866. What if we had seen this image in 1850? Would we have looked at it entirely differently? It has some beautiful curving lines. It's a very smooth porcelain finish. There are some piercings. It could almost appear to have a couple handles. We might think about what kind of a function it served, but we can certainly think about it as a piece of art based on the qualities, the line, the shape, the textures. It's got some very artistic qualities. Duchamp obviously liked to break boundaries. He was always pushing the envelope. He didn't put this on display until 1917 as one of his ready-mades. And the bicycle wheel that became an art form as a sculpture. He loved testing the waters. It was all about testing the waters. What makes ready-mades or mass-produced art forms not art? Where is that fine line between art and not art? So even if you don't love this piece, if you think about the function that it served in its time and place in the early 1900s, which again was a post-war period where people were trying to make sense of the world. But we are still thinking about those boundaries. What does constitute art and what doesn't? And that is a whole nother lecture. Okay, next slide. This is Jackson Pollock in Grade Rainbow, 1953. Pollock is also testing the waters. What is art? What is art comprised of? Just because this is composed of colors, lines, shapes, there's the illusion of depth and space. All of the materials, the skills, the techniques of painting are there, but it becomes a very frustrating piece for many people. They certainly don't love it. It's back to the active involvement, those slashing dark marks that we saw on de Kooning's woman. However, this time there is no figure. which many people find extremely frustrating. I happen to live with an engineer, and my husband has a very difficult time with art that does not involve a figure. There has to be something recognizable. So this was actually quite nice. I got to practice on him and him asking me a lot of questions about these artwork. So Pollock also painted on very large scale. You have to become engaged in the piece. We're surrounded by it. We see the lights, the darks, we see the very subtle colors towards the bottom. And Jackson Pollock was all about active painting, the action of putting the marks on the paper. So this is another piece that we look at and say, okay, so because it's made of all of the elements of art, the principles of art, is it art or is it not? And many people have very big problems trying to love it. Okay, next. This is a Zen garden in Kyoto, Japan. And we're pretty familiar with them. I don't know if everyone realizes that a Zen garden is always kept very simple. It's a place to meditate. They originated in China. They're very well known in Japan, and there are Zen gardens everywhere. You can find Zen gardens. They are to be free from distractions, convey a sense of infinity. In this case, this one has rocks. But if you notice, the rocks almost become islands on this sea of slightly textured white gravel. It's a place to be away from outside influences. It's always peaceful and quiet. Next slide. This is Robert Rauschenberg's white painting, 1951. This was brought up by several people as I hate it. Not only do I not love it, I hate it. I just don't get it. I did find it interesting, and this is interesting here looking at it on a different screen. It's called white painting. When I put it on my screen at home, it's a little bit blue. On the screen I'm looking at right now, it's almost a little yellowy, and you may see it differently on your screen. So even though we're saying it's a white painting, white takes on a huge number of variations. It's not all what we might think of as pure white. Rauschenberg used the canvas as a screen, sensitive to the ambient effects of the space, the light, the shadows, weather. Isn't that like that Zen garden? That white gravel changes throughout the day with the effects of light, the shadows, the weather. And Rauschenberg claimed on these paintings that today is their maker, meaning they change every day. He felt the painting becomes whatever the viewer brings to it. It's the essence of peace and quiet, no distractions. This happens to be on 2 panels, and I don't remember the size, but it's very large. So when you are looking at it, it's like a wall. He was another artist that was testing the waters. What is art? What do you have to do to create art? And I also found this very interesting. I don't know if any of you are aware of a composer named John Cage. And John Cage is well known for a composition in 1952, 1 year after this painting was done. And the title of the composition is 4 minutes and 33 seconds. And it is performed in the absence of deliberate sound. I happened to be at Symphony Hall in Chicago, and the Chicago Symphony performed this piece. It was a most interesting experience because the director got up and started the score and then put his baton down. And we listened to what supposedly was total silence for 4 minutes and 33 seconds. However, it's not silent. You can hear people breathing. You hear little clicks and rustles as people move. It is not silent. But every time that would be performed, it would be different. We are all in different locations right now, but I'm sure if you try to sit silently for 4 minutes and 33 seconds, you will find that there are very subtle sounds that you hear. So even his 4 minutes and 33 seconds meant to be silent is not silent, and it changes every time. Rauschenberg's white painting is very similar to that. If you sit down in front of the painting and just sit, meditate, contemplate as you would in a Zen garden, you will find that the image does change as any person walks through, as the light changes, which maybe doesn't happen a lot in a museum, but in a lot of art galleries, there would be light changes based on the time of day. So it does change. So I thought that was very interesting. As I worked on this presentation, I came up with more questions than I had answers. So I'd like you to think about, how do Rauschenberg and John Cage and a Zen garden all fit together? What similarities are there? Okay, next slide. This is Warhol's Marilyn Diptych. And soon after Marilyn Monroe died from a questionable drug overdose, Warhol used the publicity photo from her film Niagara to create this piece. As a printmaker, in which he is working in an art form that is so easily reproduced, it's so easy to make reproductions that are identical, almost identical, or quite a variation, but it's about printmaking. He made his prints about life in the 60s. Mass production, consumerism seemed to dominate our lives and our culture. He felt that Americans especially were obsessed with fashion, fame, sensationalism, and individuals were seen as products rather than human beings. Celebrities were given status like a saint. They became icons. And I'm kind of thinking, I'm not sure it's changed. It's 60 years later. Has it really changed? I'm not so sure. He liked to try to show the various sides, knowing that when you look at Marilyn in the upper left corner and you look to the one to the right, it might appear to be the same, but as you start looking at it, you will find that there are slight variations. Now, on the other side, with no color, his variations became much more apparent. Next slide.
I was actually going to pop in here for a second. We had a comment from the audience.
Okay.
And I was like, it's a good opportunity to remind people that this is a malware program, and there's been a lot of thought-provoking sort of like imagery shown and your perspective on how these relate to both the context of time and the context of painting. They're not just sort of coming out of nowhere when they are created. There's either a period in time or a tradition of that art making that they're referencing. Yes. James commented though that he's in agreement with your husband that he has very little use for a Pollock or an all-white painting with a line in the middle.
He's not the only one. He's not the only one. There are a lot of people that feel that way. And the whole focus here is that I'm not intending to make you love any of these objects. I just want you to think about the context in which they were done, the lifestyle, the culture, what was happening at that particular time and place. And it became in the 20th century, more so than before, a very individualistic approach. When we look at the Impressionists, we start to see more variation from artist to artist. But by the time we get into modern art, 1950 and beyond, I don't even think you can call things by a movement, because when we look at pop art, they are the artists that are practicing what they're calling pop art are so different. It's a very personal approach. It's much more about the individual and their existence in the culture, in the particular culture, their own time and place. But if we don't look at the artist individually, we will never understand where they were coming from. And another thing I used to always tell my kids at school is they're going, I don't get it, I don't like it, I don't understand why it's in a museum. Well, this is the way it happens to be. You might not like it. There are many things that happen in history that we don't like, but events that occur in history change what happens next. None of us love war, but every war changes, every battle changes what happens next. So without those things that we maybe don't like, we see how the art world can change. We see how our world can change. Does that help a little bit?
Well, it helps me, but I don't know if I needed help. I think that one, and I come from an education background too, in terms of like, how I got to where I am now. I've taught in classrooms. And one of the things I've always, tried to impart to my students, and then also try to hold myself to that same standard, is that sure, I have my subjective likes and dislikes, but to
Of
me,
course, we all do.
it's like so much less interesting than trying to see what's in front of me. Like I can, like if I'm going there and I can just dismiss it or love it, that doesn't take as much thought. But if I truly try to see what's there, regardless of the outcome, then to me that feels more important than a subjective sort of valuation. Summer just kind of chimed in too and said that
I saw something run across my screen and I was trying to read it, but it's gone.
Summer said that she hears a lot of people say about Pollock in particular that they could do that, but that
and you think you can, right? How many times did I hear that as an educator? I could do that. Try it.
And then I think, but like her, and then she wants to like her, she went on to say, but you didn't. And so like, there's also that point that not only do you feel like you can,
you could have, but you didn't.
But you didn't because you didn't have that same urge, or you put your energies elsewhere. I'm also noticing that somebody's raising their hand, although it went away. And I was going to let that person maybe just ask the question. So it was Sandra. Sandra, I'm going to allow you to talk if you want to take yourself off mute and ask your question. And if not, we'll let the moment pass. It may have been an accident.
Sandra is now saying, no, I don't want to talk.
Well, Sandra, I'm gonna put you back as an attendee, and you can always just type your question into. I want to give Marcia some time to finish up her presentation, but feel free to ask the question as well.
Okay. So I believe I was saying something about the intention is not for you to love every piece I'm showing you. You won't, I know that. But to at least put forth some effort into understanding. I'll be honest, I had never really explored Bacon. I just hadn't. I've seen that painting a million times and I look at it and go, that's rather repulsive and I really don't care, and wandered by it. But now I was forced to look at it. And the more I looked at it, I thought, the artist did accomplish what he was intending to accomplish in rather repulsive ways, perhaps, but that gut feeling is there. I see it, I feel it. And I don't think I really did before. I was just repulsed and walked away from it, didn't bother looking. There were other things in the room that interested me more. I see something from Sandra. I think as an art educator myself, and then I can't read the rest of it. It's not there.
I'll read the rest of it. So
okay.
I think as an art educator myself, I feel I always wanted to influence my students to appreciate art more than anything else.
And I agree, that's where we need to be. We have to face it as educators. I was in the public schools for almost 40 years. We know our students are not necessarily going to go out and be artists per se. I have many that are artists, and I'm very proud of their accomplishments. But I am even more proud of those that are willing to go out and look and think and make calls, do the research, and then make a call on the art after they know something about it. And probably one of my favorite things that ever happened, I had a young man in his 20s who had a job that he traveled around the US, and he found himself in several major cities. And he said, I just want you to know, Mrs. Carson, you ruined my life. Oh, how did I do that? He said, I go into these cities and I can't just walk down the street. I keep looking up and going, oh, that's an Ionic column. Oh, that's Corinthian. I think that's Beaux Arts style. He said, I just can't get it out of my head. I said, well, I'm so happy that I ruined your life in that way. If we could ruin all of their lives in that way, what an accomplishment that would be. Just to get them to look, to think. That's our job as educators, to look and to think. Okay, next one is also a Warhol. Next slide. And this is, since printmaking allows the artist to make reproductions, I just thought these were 4 great examples of Warhol's artwork and how things do become so repetitive over and over and over. And the repetition of the object makes it much less personal. We don't look at Marilyn Monroe or Elvis and think about what they were really like as people. We look at them as objects. We look at them as icons, and we seem to lose that personal part. And his idea of the repetition, I think, really shows us that that's where we often are. And we need to stop and look and think differently. Okay, now the next one, we're going back to something that probably everybody's going to look at and go, well, you can't hate this. It's the Ghent altarpiece from 1432, the Van Eyck brothers. And this is the entire piece open. And if you look at the bottom section, the large picture on the bottom, the large image on the bottom, on the next slide, we're looking at just that image. This is the adoration of the Lamb. And what we see are groups of people. We see a lamb up on what appears to be an altar. And the lamb, we'll get to a close-up of the lamb in a minute, but the lamb is the sacrificial lamb. In Revelation chapter 5, verse 6, and I beheld, and lo, in the midst of the throne and in the midst of the elders stood a lamb as it had been slain. Well, this depiction, he's not slain. When we look at the next slide, on the lower left, the lamb has been punctured and the blood is pouring into the chalice while everyone watches. So the slain is not quite right. He's standing there looking very thrilled. But we know that this is, the lamb is the symbol of Christ's slaughter for our salvation. We see the elders gathered around to watch, the blood is flowing into the chalice, and wine is used as a symbol, the Holy Communion, as the symbol of the blood that Christ gave for his followers. Now, the function of this set of 4 slides, I want to talk a little bit about blood in art. On the top left, we see a Greek amphora, and that is a bull being led to slaughter. And the Greeks sacrifice domestic animals at an altar. With hymn and prayer, rituals were performed. The animal was slaughtered, the blood poured on the altar, and participants in the ceremony ate the meat. On the lower right is a Mayan image. And in this Mayan image, the man is drawing his own blood in order to communicate with the gods or the ancestors. The tongue is pierced. He is drawing a vine with thorns through his tongue, and the blood is being collected to sacrifice to the gods. Most rituals are to communicate with the gods. The upper right picture is from Pamplona, Spain, which is not necessarily an artwork, it's just a photograph of what goes on. And in Pamplona, Spain, they still practice the 13th century festival, began in the 13th century, to honor San Fermin, patron saint of Pamplona. Before the race begins, participants are in a ritual. They sing a benediction to San Fermin, asking for protection. And even now, after the run, there are bullfights during which the bulls are killed. So there is still sacrificial blood, and that's what I want to talk a little bit about now. We see these in these four images, and I seriously doubt that any of us have any serious issues with any of these photographs, any of the images. We consider them to be works of art. We are not surprised at all when we see them in a museum or a gallery. They are works of art. Next slide. So why do we have so much trouble with this one? And I apologize, this is Ana Mendieta with one T, not two. But I had already sent my slides to Micah, so I was too late to fix it. This is Death of a Chicken. It's a 1972 film. This happens to be a still from that film. If we can look at those other images and call them art and not hate them, why is this so difficult to deal with? Ana Mendieta had a decapitated chicken, and she was allowing the blood to wash over her body. So I want to go back to, I know it makes most of us feel a little uncomfortable. I want to go back to the context. Ana Mendieta was born in Cuba in 1948. In 1961, when she was 13, she was part of Operation Peter Pan. I was totally unaware of this. In Operation Peter Pan, over 14,000 unaccompanied Cuban minors were brought to the US by the Catholic Welfare Bureau because of rumors that the communists were planning to terminate parental rights. So the parents gave permission for these over 14,000 children to be brought to the US by the Catholic Welfare Bureau. She ended up living in a group home in Iowa. Her parents did eventually come to the US, but it was more than a decade later. So she is uprooted from her home in Cuba at the age of 13 and put in Iowa in a group home. As a child, she was familiar with a religion called Santeria. It was a religion that fused Catholicism, Spiritism, and the Yoruba religion of West Africa that had been brought over by slaves. After she arrived in the US, she always felt this longing for the cultural existence that she had known in Cuba. It's a pretty complicated religion. It's polytheistic. It involves rituals such as drumming, singing, and dancing, and deities known as I believe I'm pronouncing this correctly, orica. Every human connects to a specific orica, and sacrifices are made to connect with your orica, which require animal blood. So now we go to the 70s. Remember, she was born in 1948, so she's 20 plus. Feminist art, performance art, body and earth art were flourishing. And we have Mendieta creating her own ritual using blood sacrifice of a religion she was familiar with as a child. It might be disturbing to us, but in this context, does it begin to make a little sense what she's doing? Why is what others were doing in other cultures and times acceptable, and this is not? Now, I know there are lots of animal rights groups, and we have a lot of other issues going on that fall into this. However, in this particular case, we're dealing with a young woman who is trying to connect with her orica through sacrifice. Okay, did this one bring up any questions, Micah? I guess he's not listening to me.
I am, but sometimes my little docking bar does not come up quickly.
Oh, I said so.
I'm not seeing questions.
Oh my goodness, I would expect them, because actually one of my teacher friends brought this up. She said, this is one that kids have a very difficult time dealing with. But the more I read about her, and I'm going, I had never heard of this thing called the Peter Pan, Operation Peter Pan, and 14,000 kids brought over from Cuba. I had never heard of that. Of course, I was 12. Okay, so now we'll go on to something that might be a little more visually appealing, something everybody will love. Next slide. Here we have some ceramics and some textiles. Nothing uncomfortable here. They may not be the ones you love the most, but they're certainly lovely. You can't argue about that. They're beautiful illustrations. We see flowers. We see the lovely calligraphy. Some great things. So now let's move to 1974 to 79. Next slide, excuse me. Judy Chicago's dinner party. This is all ceramics and tapestry. So what's the big deal? What's the problem? Ceramics and tapestry are normally women's work. This particular exhibit was described by an LA critic as sleaze and cheese. Judy Chicago's work, The Dinner Party, was a communal piece dedicated to the women who are so often left out of history. The installation is triangular. Each side is 48 feet long, and there are 39 place settings on each side of the triangle. And on the floor, which is not visible in that image, there were white tile, and inscribed in gold on the tile were another 999 names of women that Judy Chicago felt had been left out of history. Next slide. This, oh, you know what? Go back one. Can you go back one, Micah? Oh, nope, that was forward. Okay, whoops, okay. The two that I put on there, remember there are, there are 39 of them. But the two that I put there were Sojourner Truth, who was a Black woman, an abolitionist. We've probably all heard of Sojourner Truth by now. And the poet Emily Dickinson on the right. Now the next slide is a close-up of Georgia O'Keeffe. Well, I believe that the biggest problem that people had with this is that all of the place settings, which were totally non-functional, they were sculptural pieces, they were based on something to do with the woman that they were created for, but they all became female sexual organs. So that became a big issue. However, when Judy Chicago was questioned about that, her comment was, it was to make the point that there is nothing that groups these women together. All of these women that she has in this project, nothing groups them together. They are all from different epochs, different eras, different countries, different races, different ethnicities, different religions, different class. The only thing that ties them all together is they all had vaginas, which meant we did not know who they were because they were female. So one of the New York Times art critics, Roberta Smith, said, you can call Judy Chicago's work what you will, kitsch, pornography, artifact, feminist propaganda, or a major work of 20th century art. It doesn't make a difference. What's important is the dinner party is important. It made a difference in art and perceptions of women. Next slide.
So I wanted to hop in real quick as we approach the end.
Sure, I only have one more slide.
Oh, well, yeah, I'm gonna go ahead and go to the next slide then we'll talk.
Oh, okay. So I just posted a few other things here that I thought were interesting. There's scarification from West Africa. Is that art? Do you love it? Do you hate it? Should it not be art? The second slide is for one of my former students, Justin, who is been out of school for a long time, but he keeps sending me images of this because he never got it. And actually, this is where this particular topic started. You don't have to love it. I just want you to understand it. So Justin, the Brancusi is for you. We look at things like the Thomas Kincaid print. You know, those are, a lot of people love them. They have a lot of things in common with, from my point of view, with Warhol. Is Elvis on black velvet? How about that? How do we feel about it? Then we have Serrano's Piss Christ. Brings up a lot of topics. We have a Buddhist painting that most people have no clue how to interpret that. And then of course, there's always the one that many people can't love, is Picasso in one of his many forms. So I hope I have answered a few questions for you. I'll be happy to take more questions if we have time. And I've probably created a lot of questions, and that's okay. My main thing is, don't be afraid of art. Don't be turned off by it. Try to learn about it. Try to get it into your context, your comfort zone, and think about it in the context of when and where it was done and by whom. So thank you all for allowing me to share my love of art with you. And now, Micah, I'm done.
Thank you, Marcia. I just want to make sure that we give people time to maybe submit a couple questions if they would like. Sandra made a point that about the piece with the chicken. I already forgot the artist's name. I wasn't familiar with that piece.
Anna Mendieta.
Yeah, so she mentioned that it's probably, the combination of it being not only a nude, but then it looks as if it could be referencing like female menstruation as well.
And I had not thought about it from that point.
And then, when you think about it, it's like, it's very, it's not all that dissimilar, obviously, for some of the reasons why maybe Judy Chicago's piece would make people uncomfortable. And that's, the portrayal of female bodies, the relative sort of like intentional, maybe sometimes mystery that is sort of like preserved by not talking about it publicly, and like how people, probably mostly male critics, will be uncomfortable with these ideas of female sexual organs or biological processes, right? They're uncomfortable with the idea of blood or menstruation.
Right, I understand that. There are a lot of artworks that make us uncomfortable, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't try to understand the function, the purpose, what was the artist's intent. I'm not saying you have to love it.
Well, I appreciate that sentiment. I know we're seeing some compliments as well. James wanted to just say, great job.
Thank you, James.
I know that, I know several of the people who are watching are regular attendees of our traditional Art in Focus format. So I just do want to give everybody a chance if they want to have questions, or if Summer wants to ask any questions. But I just want to emphasize that I appreciate sort of the wide range of work that you sampled, some of the connections you made, seeing another person's insight, and then just the idea of trying to understand what you see before you judge it. And I'll say that whilst I was familiar with the vast majority of that work, there is still several pieces, obviously, as I just demonstrated by not remembering the name of it.
Well, I will tell you the majority of the pieces came from either my experiences teaching or from my peers teaching or the students. And having taught AP art history and having taught art history at IUN, it's a little older crowd, but even the high school kids, just take a step back. My teaching partner for many years, Laura, is still teaching and teaching art history in Hammond. And she is the one who brought up the Ana Mendieta piece.
Oh, right. Okay.
And then she later said to me, I said I was using it, and she said, will your presentation be okay for high school kids? And I said, well, there's nothing in there that I would not have shown my high school kids. First of all, I think people who are interested in art are a little more open-minded than the general public.
Right.
The other thing is, if you have already talked about that with your kids, then I don't think there's a problem. And I did try to choose an image that was a little more discreet than some of the images from the video. But we need to ask questions. We need to think about context. And the more I read about Ana Mendieta, I just went, oh my gosh, what did we do to her life? Yeah. Pulling her out of Cuba, pulling her out of what she was used to and trying to change her into Iowa.
Yeah.
How does that all play out in your head when you're 13?
It's a good question.
Sure.
So I want to make sure Linda Boyle from Bloomington wanted to say that she was happy that you invited her, and that
my oldest friends from college.
And then as a closing question, maybe if you just had maybe you can't answer it, but if you just had sort of one you could pull out of your presentation. Summer wanted to know if there was a piece that you shared that you have struggled with more than others in terms of understanding or being comfortable with.
Well, I sort of mentioned that with the Francis Bacon, because I can tell you exactly where it hangs at the Art Institute.
Yeah.
And as I walk by it, I see it, but I just kind of, I don't want to deal with it. I don't want to, I find it a little repulsive. I don't want to go there. But there are a couple others at the Art Institute, the Rembrandt, the Sides of Beef. I just ugh, why? But there are reasons why. And the more I learned about Bacon, the more I thought, he makes a valid point. Yeah. There are some valid points here. We just need to get into the artist's head a little bit. And I don't know if we'll ever get totally into Pollock's head, because I'm not sure it was about this as much as the moving and the physical application of the paints.
Absolutely. Well, Marcia, as always, it's a pleasure. We're a little over time, so I want to be, both respectful of your time as well as our audience, but mostly also the building is going to close. You're at the center.
I better get out before I get locked in.
No, unless you want to spend the night there. Yeah. So thank you. You're always welcome. You know that. My closing two things I want to remind everybody is that we have 2 more Art in Focus for the season. Next time, not only is, we have a guest. We have Jamie Schumacher, artist, activist, now author. She's not from around here, which is the value, I guess, or the benefit of being able to host these virtually. But the other thing of note is that will be the first time that our new director of education, Summer Sharinghausen. And I say new, but it's just because everything's in the suspended state this last year. But our new director of education will be hosting, so you'll get a chance to see Summer do an art in focus, host an art in focus. You'll be seeing a lot more of her doing that in the future. And then the last one is a metalsmith from San Diego, my friend Carrie Ann Quick. That'll be the last one that I host. So please join us May 6th and May 20th, 7 o'clock. The links will be on our website. Once again, Marcia, I appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
All right, good night, everybody.